Thank you, Ambassador Studio. Thank you very much. So we are now, I would like to call both Michelle Caruso Cabrera and Michael Froman to the stage. As we're saying, there's a lot going on in the world, increasingly polarized world, and many governments, as we have seen, are very in great trouble to answer to the questions of ordinary people. And so this inability is increasing the pressure on corporations to respond. So they will go through, I think, a very interesting conversation considering what is happening these days in the world. Michelle?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fernando. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're going to talk a lot about the coming agenda of the day, but there were tragic events over the weekend with Hamas attacking Israel and slaughtering hundreds and hundreds of Israelis. So I wanted to start there, Ambassador Froman, and ask you your thoughts on the situation, and are you concerned about wider escalation as we see Israel in a full state of war?
Well, it is a tragic situation, and Israel faces no great choices at the moment. It has allegedly sealed off the border and recaptured the southern areas where there had been incursions, but now faces the question of what to do about Gaza. And its natural inclination will be to retaliate hard and to go after Hamas in a very serious way, complicated by the fact, one, that Gaza is a very difficult place to fight, a very dense population, very dense organization. And secondly, of course, there's 130 plus hostages there, Israelis and citizens from other countries as well. And so there's likely to be a very significant additional loss of life over the coming days and weeks in Gaza. And to your question, the real issue is, where does it go beyond that? As there's increased loss of life in Gaza, does that mobilize Hezbollah in the north to get involved more directly? Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles aimed at Israel, can reach basically all of Israel from southern Lebanon. Does it spur on a new intifada of sorts in the West Bank? Is there instability in East Jerusalem? Are there issues with the Israeli Arabs in Israel proper? And so it could become a much more complicated multi-front conflict, which of course is exactly what Israel would like to avoid. I don't think it's likely to spill over into more interstate conflict. It's difficult to see other states in the region wanting to get directly involved, although obviously there is speculation about how much involvement Iran already has and what's going on with Hamas. But with just in the surrounding areas with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with Palestinian Jihad on the West Bank, there are other issues that other dynamics that could lead to a much more significant conflict.
Former members of senior Israeli leadership, current Israeli leadership, are expressing concern. It's obviously going to be very ugly. Images are going to be streamed across the world in social media, and already expressing concern about whether or not the United States will stand by them for as long as they feel they need to control the situation. What do you think? I think the U.S. will. I think the U.S. will be very firm in its support of Israel. I think the reaction of other countries, I think, is they're really all over a spectrum. A number of countries have come out, at least initially, in strong support and sympathy for what happened in Israel. To your point, others have been much more ambiguous, or in some, in fact, have been blaming Israel for this, for the underlying conditions. I think the question is, over time, as those images do appear, as the carnage does continue, will the support, for example, in Europe or in other countries, in other regions of the world, begin to dissipate as well? But I think the U.S. support will be very firm. And by the way, there are U.S. citizens being held in Gaza. So it's not just an issue of supporting Israel. The U.S. will have a role in wanting to make sure that it is out there protecting its citizens and doing everything it can to get them back safely. Until this happened, it seemed that it was possible that we were actually going to have what's been called a stabilization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, what I think the average person might think of as a peace agreement. The conventional wisdom is that is dead for now. Do you agree with that? Is there any life support to that? I think it's hard to imagine that continuing at the moment. Now, whether it's dead forever
or simply put on hold for now until this situation gets resolved remains to be seen. The broader dynamics in the region remain the same. And first of all, there are the underlying issues, regarding Israel and the Palestinians that still have yet to be resolved, and those are certainly part of that stabilization agreement being negotiated with the Saudis as well. But I think right now the focus will be on getting this situation resolved. It's hard to imagine the negotiations with Saudi Arabia progressing at this pace, particularly since it involves the U.S. providing a defense guarantee, and as well as issues around nuclear enrichment, as well as Palestinian issues.
So we now have two kinetic wars on the international stage. Russia having invaded Ukraine, situation in Israel, concerns about a third possible kinetic war over Taiwan. Why do you think this is happening all at the same time? Is this coincidence, or is there an underlying reason?
I don't think they're connected per se. I think there is. We went through a period for 40 years. We had the Cold War. For 30 years, we had the post-Cold War period, which was really a sort of a U.S. unipolar moment where there was a rules-based system led largely by the U.S. that established certain parameters around behavior, and whether it was economics and globalization or around respecting fundamental issues of the UN Charter around non-intervention in and changing borders through military effort. That moment is over. We don't know what the new period is. It's a much more complicated period where it's not sort of one camp versus another camp, and some have called it polyamorous. That countries will be with us, they will love us for some purposes, they will love others for other purposes. It's a much more dynamic period. It requires a lot more nuance, I think, both to understand what's going on, but also to help manage the diplomacy around it. And I think what we're seeing in the examples that you gave is that countries are pushing the envelope. They're testing the limits. Russia testing the limits by going into Ukraine, doubting the resolve of the United States and NATO, Europe across the board to stand up for Ukraine. I think a misreading. Azerbaijan going into Nagorno-Karabakh, because Russia is distracted. As you mentioned, the Taiwan lingering out there as an issue, and President Xi saying this is an issue he wants to get resolved on his watch, not an issue he wants to leave for future generations. So it's a very fragile period at the moment. There's a lot of fragmentation in the world right now, and it's all the more important that as the ambassador said, that we reaffirm certain principles that we've had for the last 80 years, and that we continue to show leadership, collective leadership, in ensuring that those principles are implemented.
That's a good segue for us to kind of move on to what is the breadth and scope of the conference and talk about some of the broader issues. Speaking about Taiwan, China, U.S. policy toward China, it's become much more hawkish under both the current administration and the previous administration. What do you think of U.S. policy towards China? Is it correct at the moment? What should we be doing?
Well, for a long time, really since 1979, we had a theory around engaging China, and that if we engaged with China, they would continue on this path of economic reform and liberalization. Some people thought there might actually be political reform and liberalization too. But even leaving that aside, there was a thought that over time, China would become more like us, and that they would join the international system and uphold the international rules, which they have benefited enormously from. No country has benefited more from the rules-based trading system, for example, and the globalization that came with that than China. It helped lift hundreds of millions of people in China out of poverty. What we found over the last 2 decades is that process of economic liberalization has not been as linear, as fast, and has not gone as far, I think, as many people hoped. And as a result, instead of them becoming more like us, we're finding that we're becoming more like them. And so we are now engaging in industrial policy, which we used to criticize them for. We are screening investments in our country, which they have always kept U.S. firms out of certain sectors of their economy. We have engaged in protectionism and put up tariffs and kept out their products. They've done the same to a much greater degree, in fact, over the last couple of decades. And I think that's a sign of the frustration that the United States and other countries have had with the inability to move China in a more constructive direction. I think the challenge now is that while there is great consensus, as you said, Democratic and Republican administrations in Congress, both sides of the aisle, and more so between the U.S. and its partners, including Europe, about the nature of the China challenge, there is much less consensus about what to do about it and what the new equilibrium should be between China and the U.S. or China and the rest of the world. Is it a new Cold War? Is it détente? Is it peaceful coexistence? Is it some formulation that has no analog in the U.S.-Soviet period because it's a different kind of relationship? And that, I think, needs a lot more attention. The Biden administration has laid out that there are issues we should be cooperating on, like climate change, North Korea, nonproliferation. There are issues that we need to very carefully manage potential conflict around, like Taiwan and the South China Sea, where our militaries are in close proximity to each other. And there are areas where we're just going to compete with each other around technology and the economy. I think that framework makes a lot of sense. The challenge is the Chinese have not accepted it.
No.
And so it's hard to have a framework that will only one side accept it. They talk about win-win cooperation, peaceful coexistence, and mutual respect, another three conceps. But I think that the challenge is they're not willing to cooperate. They're not willing to do some of the common sense things, I think, in terms of military-to-military communication to avoid escalation and mistakes, because we are still very much committed, and we are, in fact, ramping up our economic and technological competition.
Just one example of that, people involved in dealing with the Chinese when it comes to climate change say, okay, this is something we should all be working on together. And yet, when they approach the Chinese about it, they want concessions on other fronts.
That's right.
And so it becomes very difficult to actually cordon off the areas that we'd like to.
I think that's right. And I don't, it's easy for us to say, well, it's in China's interest to deal with climate change. It's in China's interest to deal with nonproliferation or to deal with avoiding military-to-military escalation in sensitive areas. They have not defined their interest that way. It's hard to tell another country what's in its interests when it doesn't fully believe that. But it puts us in a fragile situation. So the conversations, the senior level contacts that have been had between the administration and China, I think are a good step. I think they've begun to take a little bit of the emotion out of the relationship, perhaps de-escalate it a bit. But we shouldn't confuse a meeting with progress. A meeting is necessary but not sufficient. And now what we need to do, and hopefully when President Biden meets President Xi in the Bay Area in November, they can begin to draw a line on the relationship and focus on areas where we might find ways of cooperating with each other.
Another tough area of the world, Ukraine. Up until very recently, the U.S. and Western allies have stood firm in saying we are going to support Ukraine. But now we see the recent budget situation where funding for Ukraine was left out, and we're also starting to see cracks in certain parts of Europe. Where does this go? Are we going to stick by Ukraine? How does this play out?
I think the reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the coherence of the Western alliance and other countries, 50 countries, has really been remarkable. I think Putin underestimated it. I think it's probably come as somewhat of a surprise to many in the West as well. And so, yes, it is beginning to fray, at least at the edges. But I do think fundamentally people in Europe and people in the United States understand that what's at stake in Ukraine is much greater than Ukraine itself. The Ukrainian situation is critical. It's a tragedy in and of itself. But it's also about what it means for the rules-based system and what a Russian victory there would mean for unleashing other countries who would want to change borders through the use of force and challenge other international rules. So I think at the end of the day, cooler heads will prevail and support will continue to be there. Having said that, I think there was this expectation that there would be this major counteroffensive this summer and fall, that it would fundamentally change the facts on the ground, and that would lay the groundwork for negotiation. At least as of this moment, it feels like that counteroffensive is less than fully decisive. And certainly if you're sitting in the Kremlin looking at the politics and the political debate in the United States, you might say we should wait until November to see what happens with the election before being compelled to sit down at the negotiating table. There will be a lot of hard decisions to make next year, fundamentally by the Ukrainians, as to what they are willing to accept, both in terms of future bloodshed, but also in terms of negotiation and compromise. Right now, it's premature to do that, but those will be squarely on the agenda, I believe, next year.
You made reference to other countries that might be more emboldened to make an effort to change their borders. Was that China, or is that bigger than that?
Well, I think China is clearly watching what's going on in Ukraine and drawing lessons from it. There are multiple lessons to be drawn, though. It can point to different directions. I mean, one lesson to be drawn has been the resolve of other countries to come together and to defend Ukraine and to defend the rules-based system. Also, the difficulty of actually taking over another country when you've got strong resistance there as well. So I think right now the focus of the U.S. and others is to ensure that we're doing everything we possibly can to enhance the deterrence in the Asia-Pacific, to deter China from thinking about taking kinetic action against Taiwan, because nobody wants a war there with China over Taiwan.
Another dominant headline that we've all been living with for the last several months is artificial intelligence and its arrival and the implications of it. What do you see as the opportunities and the risks associated with AI? And is it possible to manage? Is it possible to regulate it? Is it too early? Do we know enough?
Well, I think we're all trying to learn more about it, and far be it for me to pretend as though I'm an expert in AI. All I would say is it appears to be really one of the most meaningful and significant technological innovations that we've lived through, with tremendous positive opportunities associated with it, potentially. As you said, also it comes with significant risks. I think the challenge is it's very hard to see how governments and regulators can possibly keep up with the pace of innovation that the private sector is engaging in right now. It's hard enough to fully understand what's going on, let alone trying to get ahead of it and set rules and parameters and guardrails, and yet that's precisely what needs to be done. I think the good news is the companies, the innovators themselves have been among the most vocal to say, we want to be regulated. We need some guardrails here. They've learned, I think, lessons from previous generations of technology innovators who tried to keep regulators at arm's length. And I think here they really do want to take on what are the issues around ethical AI, how do you avoid bias, how do you put guardrails around the integration of AI into, for example, weapon systems and autonomous weapon systems? How do you prevent large language models from helping people not just write term papers, but get access to information to build a weapon of mass destruction more easily? So a lot of issues out there that need to be addressed. The European Union is moving ahead with its regulation, as it tends to do. The U.S. has put out its principles. The Biden administration put out its voluntary principles, which the companies, many companies have signed on to. So I think we're at the very, very initial stages of really beginning first to understand what it is, how it works, and two, what are some of the ways in which we can put some rules or guardrails around it. But this is going to require, I think, a fundamentally different relationship between the public and the private sector than perhaps any other technological innovation we've had to date. Some people analogize this to nuclear weapons. We came up with a new technology, And then over time, and the Council on Foreign Relations was instrumental in this, we came up with the idea of arms control and how you would negotiate constraints on that. But nuclear weapons were driven fundamentally by the public sector. It may have been private sector companies that actually built the bombs, but it was done through defense spending and through
and in the name of national security.
In the name of national security. Now we have private companies in the name of innovation creating new products that could be weapons or could be weaponized by others and used. And that's going to require a much more close hand-in-glove relationship between the public and private sectors if we're going to, again, understand what's going on and to try and get our arms around it.
You can't help but marvel at the timing of Oppenheimer coming out, right? And him, obviously, we all watching the distress he suffered as a result of having unleashed something. And then at the same time, all of these scientists now who have unleashed something and they don't know what they've unleashed.
Yes, I think one of the most, I'd say, disturbing things I heard at one of the many AI conferences and conversations that we all find ourselves part of is one of the leading innovators in this area saying, we don't actually know how it works. And my view was if he didn't know how it worked, certainly the rest of us who are not as expert as he would have very little chance of understanding that. And if you don't know how it works, well, that does seem to be kind of a first step in understanding how to put some rules around it.
One of the panels today is going to be about immigration. When you look at demographic trends in the world, the advanced economies some of them are facing straight-out declines in their populations, never mind their working populations. The U.S. could be, depending on what we do about immigration and where our birth trends go. And then, of course, we are seeing headlines all over the world about how populations within Europe and the United States don't want more immigration. How do you see this playing out? What are the implications for the United States, for the world's business community, as we grapple with this huge migration of people around the world?
Well, first, I do think the issue of demographics is perhaps one of the most important sleeper issues out there. When you look at the trends that demographers see and go out to 2100 and say, okay, well, India clearly is going to be the largest country, followed by Nigeria. China is going to shrink by several hundred million people. Japan is going to shrink very significantly. Europe will likely be smaller. U.S. will be the same or slightly larger. I mean, the whole the dynamics of what it means for the social safety net in these countries, what it means for the social contract, for social cohesion, let alone for the dynamics of the global economy, are going to be fundamentally different. I think here in this country and in other advanced countries, there is this schizophrenia around immigration because people understand. I mean, just look at this country where so much of our strength has come from immigration. Just even this generation right now, the innovation that's going on in technology, the research and development, we've benefited enormously from people coming from all over the world who want to work in this environment where there's a strong rule of law, a very robust risk-taking environment, venture capital, strong universities with their research and development programs. It's been a huge strength of the U.S. And if you believe that innovation and technology indeed is the most important attribute of economic success going forward, immigration certainly needs to be part of it. The debate here has been going on for decades, and the issues are not that difficult, but it's very difficult to get the political will to get them done in terms of, on one hand, providing for secure borders, and on the other hand, for creating pathways for additional legal immigration. Other countries, I think, have done it better than we have, including our northern neighbor, Canada, who I think have managed to attract a lot of people who would otherwise want to have come to the United States and ended up going to Canada because it was easier to get in there and much more difficult to make their way into our system. That's our loss, and we should be finding ways to fix that.
Mr. Ambassador, thanks for setting the stage as we begin the rest of the conference. Great. Thanks.